In 1913, America changed in ways most families did not fully understand until it was far too late. In February, Washington gained the constitutional power to tax income directly. In April, senators stopped answering to state legislatures and started answering to mass elections. In December, a new central banking structure took control of the nation's currency and credit. 3 structural changes: 1 calendar year, 1 Congress, 1 president signing each piece into law. That alone would make 1,913 remarkable. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to see these as isolated reforms that just happen to arrive at the same time. What if the most important revolution in American life was not announced with cannon fire or marching soldiers? What if it arrived through paperwork, committee reports, carefully timed votes, and promises that sounded temporary? What if the year that reshaped your paycheck, your representation, and your money supply was sold to the public not as a transfer of power, but as common sense reform? Stay with me, because once you see how these pieces fit together, it becomes very hard to unsee. And if this kind of documented history matters to you, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who still thinks 1,913 was just another page in a textbook. Before 1913, the relationship between an American worker and the federal government looked very different. For decades after the Civil War, income tax was repealed in 1872. Most families lived in a country where the federal government did not automatically stand between labor and wages. There was no withholding from each paycheck as a permanent feature of life. Federal revenue came overwhelmingly from customs duties and excise taxes, especially on alcohol and tobacco. That older system meant something almost difficult to imagine now. Most working Americans experienced their wages first as family income, not as money routed through a federal claim system before reaching the kitchen table. That system did not survive the new century untouched. To understand why 1,913 moved so quickly, you have to step back to 1,907. In October of that year, confidence in the American financial system collapsed. Banks failed, depositors panicked, credit tightened, markets convulsed. The federal government had no modern central bank and no reliable mechanism to flood the system with liquidity in a crisis. So the country leaned on one private titan, J.P. Morgan assembled bankers, coordinated emergency support, and helped steady the system by sheer force of reputation and capital. It was not the first time a private financial magnate had been called on to stabilize national affairs, and that was precisely the problem. A modern industrial nation could not keep discovering, in every panic, that the emergency response plan was essentially to hope one banker would step forward again. Out of that shock came a serious demand for banking reform. That part should be stated plainly. The old system was vulnerable. Recurrent panics were destructive. Families, farmers, workers, and businesses all paid the price when credit froze and banks failed. The need for reform was real. But history becomes uncomfortable when the same people best positioned to benefit from a new structure also helped design it behind closed doors. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act and created the National Monetary Commission to study banking reform. The commission was chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, one of the most powerful political figures in the country. He spent the next 2 years studying European banking systems and preparing for what he believed America needed most: a central bank of some kind. Then came one of the most famous secret meetings in American financial history, a meeting so strange in its details that people often dismiss it as folklore the first time they hear it. In late November 1910, Aldrich and a small group of insiders quietly traveled to the Jekyll Island club off the coast of Georgia, an exclusive private retreat used by some of the wealthiest men in the nation. They moved with unusual secrecy. Participants later described being instructed to use first names only. One of them, Paul Warburg, reportedly carried a borrowed shotgun to help preserve the cover story that they were on a duck hunting trip. The secrecy was not accidental. They knew that if the public learned Wall Street-connected financiers had privately drafted the blueprint for a central banking system, the plan would be politically radioactive before it was ever introduced. The 6 men at the center of that gathering were not random theorists. Aldrich was there, along with his secretary, Arthur Shelton. Henry P. Davison represented the Morgan interests. Frank Vanderlip brought the National City Bank connection. closely associated with Rockefeller influence. A. Piat Andrew linked the group to the Treasury, and Paul Warburg, the German-born banker whose expertise in European central banking systems was widely respected, supplied key conceptual architecture. For days they argued, drafted, revised, and refined. What emerged from that secluded session became known as the Aldrich Plan, a proposal for a new banking structure with regional branches and centralized coordinating power. It did not pass in its original form, but it set the frame. Much of the intellectual DNA that later appeared in the Federal Reserve System was incubated there. Now pause on that point, because this is where the story becomes more than a simple narrative of reform happened. While these men were shaping a new monetary architecture, Congress was also confronting a different problem: the concentration of financial power itself. In 1912, the House authorized what became known as the Peugeot Committee investigation into the money trust. The hearings dug into interlocking directorates, financial coordination, and the extraordinary concentration of influence centered around a small network of major New York institutions. The findings were explosive. A relatively small circle of banking and corporate leaders had gained influence across railroads, industry, mining, transportation, communications, and finance. And among the names linked to this network was Paul Warburg, one of the very men who had helped shape the central banking proposal at Jekyll Island. That is the tension that makes 1913 so difficult to discuss honestly. The case for reform was legitimate. The concentration of financial power was also legitimate. But the architecture of the proposed cure overlapped with the people named near the center of the disease. This does not prove a cartoon conspiracy. It does something more unsettling. It raises the possibility that reform can be both necessary and captured at the same time. A broken system can be real, and the solution offered to fix it can still be designed in ways that preserve elite leverage rather than eliminate it. Then 1913 arrived, and the pieces began falling into place with astonishing speed. On February 3, the 16th Amendment was ratified, giving Congress the constitutional authority to lay and collect taxes on incomes without apportioning them among the states. This mattered more than many Americans realized in the moment. It created a scalable revenue instrument, one capable of growing with the ambitions of the federal state. At first, defenders emphasized that this power would be used narrowly and fairly. It would touch the wealthy. It would correct imbalance. It would not descend heavily on ordinary labor. Those assurances helped sell the change. Just over 2 months later, on April 8, the 17th Amendment was ratified. Before that point, U.S. senators were chosen by state legislatures. Critics of the old system pointed to deadlocks, corruption, and backroom bargaining. Advocates of change presented direct election as a democratic improvement, and in one sense, it unquestionably was. But constitutional design often involves trade-offs, and this reform altered more than election mechanics. It changed the line of accountability. Senators who had once served as the state's institutional voice within the federal government now derived their position directly from statewide popular elections. State governments no longer selected the chamber that had once represented them as governments. The federal center had one less constitutional restraint pressing back against expansion. On its own, each reform can be explained. An income tax can be defended as a tool of fairness. Direct election can be defended as a tool of democracy. A central bank can be defended as a tool of stability. But history is not made only by the justifications offered for each part in isolation. Sometimes the real story appears only when you look at how multiple reforms interact. A scalable revenue mechanism, a weakened structural check from the states, a new system of monetary management shaped in part by private banking expertise. Each change made the others more potent. Together they formed something larger than a series of unrelated good government measures. The Revenue Act of 1913, signed in early October, put flesh on the bones of the 16th Amendment. It imposed a 1% normal tax on incomes above $3,000 for single filers and $4,000 for married couples, with surtaxes pushing the top rate to 7% on the very highest incomes. In a country where average annual income hovered far below those thresholds, the tax reached only a tiny slice of the population. That fact mattered politically. People were told, explicitly and repeatedly, that this was aimed at the rich, The first Form 1040 was brief. The burden appeared narrow. The principle looked restrained. To ordinary Americans, the structure could be marketed as both moral and harmless. A limited tax on wealthier citizens that would leave the vast majority untouched. That promise did not last, and the speed of its collapse is one of the most revealing parts of the story. By 1916, the top rate had already risen. By 1917, as wartime demands intensified, it surged again. By 1918, the top federal income tax rate had reached 77%. In just 5 years, the small income tax sold as a modest levy on the wealthy had transformed into a far more aggressive instrument. Defenders can say, with reason, that war changed everything. War always expands the appetite of the state. But that answer only deepens the underlying question. Once a scalable revenue mechanism exists, how often does government resist scaling it? How often does a tax power introduced as exceptional remain permanently restrained? The machinery, once built, tends to seek use, and then December closed the circle. On the 23rd of December 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The legislative path had been contested and the final design differed from the original Aldrich plan in important respects, but the continuity was undeniable. The intellectual groundwork from Jekyll Island remained visible in the system's bones. The final vote came just before Christmas, with the holiday deadline pressing the calendar and many senators eager to depart Washington. Contemporary observers noted the haste. Senate records preserve the striking image. After the vote, senators hurried for Union Station to catch trains home. Wilson signed the act that evening, using ceremonial pens later given to key sponsors. By nightfall, the United States had a new central banking system. This is usually where the discussion gets distorted. Either the Federal Reserve is portrayed as a flawless act of enlightened modernization, or it is described with theatrical claims that make serious people stop listening. The truth is harder and more interesting. America's financial system genuinely needed reform. The country needed better tools to respond to banking panics, manage liquidity, and stabilize credit. Yet, it is also true that the plan's gestation involved bankers and financiers operating in secrecy, and that some of the same networks being scrutinized for concentrated power were entangled in the design of the new order. The mature view is not that every reformer was a villain or that every banker was a puppet master. The mature view is that institutional redesign often occurs when public need and private influence overlap, and those moments deserve more scrutiny than they usually receive. Look at how the three changes reinforced one another. The income tax supplied the federal government with a revenue engine that could grow dramatically over time. The 17th Amendment reduced the direct role of state legislatures in checking federal consolidation. The Federal Reserve established a new framework for managing currency, credit, and financial emergencies. Revenue, representation, and money creation are not minor administrative details. They are foundational levers of power. If you were trying to remake the operating system of national life without calling it a revolution, these are exactly the areas you would touch. And what followed across the next generation made the permanence of the transformation unmistakable. The taxpayer base widened. The tax code thickened. Rates rose and fell with war, depression, and politics. But the principle remained. Direct federal claims on income were now normal. Then came another major turn in 1943, when wartime legislation entrenched employer withholding. After withholding became standard, the state no longer waited for many workers to part with a large sum later. It took its share before wages fully arrived in hand. That was not merely an administrative convenience. It changed the psychology of taxation. Money you never hold feels different from money you must consciously surrender. The architecture became not only powerful, but frictionless. Think about what a family living through those decades would have seen. A grandparent born in the late 19th century could have entered adulthood in a country without a permanent peacetime income tax, without direct election of senators, and without the Federal Reserve System. That same person could live long enough to see withholding normalized, federal fiscal capacity multiplied, and monetary governance permanently institutionalized. The daily texture of citizenship changed. The paycheck changed. The constitutional balance changed. The nation's financial bloodstream changed. Yet, because it happened through legislation rather than battlefield spectacle, later generations inherited the finished structure without feeling the shock of its construction. And that may be the most important lesson of 1000. 913. The deepest changes in a society are often the ones that arrive looking procedural. A people can be transformed by amendments, acts, commissions, conference reports, and administrative refinements just as thoroughly as by war. In some ways, more thoroughly. War is obvious. Legal architecture is quiet. Once it hardens into routine, people stop asking who designed it, what promises were made to sell it, and who benefited when those promises changed. Woodrow Wilson sits at the center of this story not because he alone caused it, but because his presidency became the point where these long-building currents converged. He signed the tariff and income tax reform. He signed the Federal Reserve Act. He presided over the political moment in which the 17th Amendment took effect. His administration helped translate years of argument, study, panic, and planning into institutional reality. Yet even Wilson's role should not distract from the larger pattern. Personalities matter, but systems outlive them. The men at Jekyll Island aged and died. The sponsors of the amendments passed from the scene. The investigators who warned about concentrated financial power are mostly forgotten. The structure remained. That is why the old promise matters so much. Only the rich will pay is not just a slogan from the past. It is a recurring sales pitch in modern politics. This will only be used in rare cases is another one. But 1913 suggests a rule people ignore at their own risk. When government acquires a new mechanism of extraction, coordination, or control, the restraint promised at birth is often the least durable part of the design. The emergency ends. The mechanism remains. The threshold drops. The scope widens. The paperwork multiplies. The temporary solution becomes the permanent baseline for the next expansion. You do not need wild theories to find this story disturbing. The dates are real. The amendments are real. The secret meeting is real. The committee investigating financial concentration is real. The overlap of names is real. The escalation of tax rates within a few years is real. The later emergence of withholding is real. The pattern is unsettling not because it requires fantasy, but because it does not. It lives inside official records, historical archives, legislative histories, treasury documents, tax records, and the institutional memory of the very bodies created or empowered during that era. So when people ask whether 1913 changed America, the answer is not complicated. It did. The harder question is what kind of change it was. Was it a sincere set of reforms that grew beyond what its authors expected? Was it an unavoidable modernization that happened under pressure from genuine systemic weakness? Was it a coordinated restructuring that packaged centralization as progress and sold long-term control through short-term reassurance? Honest people can disagree about motive. What they cannot honestly deny is scale. The year was not ordinary. It marked a transfer of capacity, fiscal, political, and monetary, toward a stronger national center and a new financial order. And once you see 1913 that way, even familiar routines look different. Filing taxes no longer feels like a timeless civic ritual. It looks like a relatively recent result of political design. The Federal Reserve no longer appears as a neutral fact of nature. It appears as the endpoint of conflict, panic, elite planning, and legislative compromise. The direct election of senators no longer sits only inside a civics chapter about democratic reform. It becomes part of a larger shift in the balance between states and the federal government. The pieces stop being trivia and start becoming architecture. That is why almost nobody talks about the year as a unified story. We are taught the amendments separately, the tax history separately, the Federal Reserve separately. Break the transformation into compartments and it looks manageable. Put it back together and it starts to look like one of the most consequential domestic restructurings in American history. Not in a blaze, not in a coup, in a sequence, in a rhythm. In a year when most people were busy living their lives while the machinery around them was redesigned. And maybe that is the final discomfort buried inside all of this. A society can surrender enormous ground while believing it is only making narrow adjustments. A family can lose an older relationship to wages, representation, and money without noticing the full meaning until decades later. A promise can be narrow at the moment of sale and expansive in the moment of use. The men who drew up plans in private can insist they acted for the public good and still shape a system that privileges concentrated power. Both can be true. That is what makes serious history harder than propaganda. It refuses easy heroes and easy villains. It shows you ambition, necessity, fear, crisis, opportunism, and idealism, all tangled together inside the same institutions. So here's the question that keeps echoing long after the dates are memorized. When your family's earnings began moving through a federal tax structure that could expand without asking whether its original promises still mattered, when state legislatures lost their direct hold on the Senate, when the nation's money system passed into a new framework drafted in part by men who met in secret on a private island, was that merely the birth of modern government? Or was it the moment the ground rules changed in ways Americans were never meant to examine as one story? The documents are public. The names are on the record. The timeline is not disputed. The only thing still missing, more than a century later, is the willingness to look at 1,913 whole.